So up next, a storyteller from Ancram, and he's telling a story about the impact of war on a toddler hidden during World War II in the Netherlands. Please welcome to the stage Joe Gosler.
Greetings. It was 1975, and I lived on the Lower East Side in a tenement flat above a bar. And I couldn't sleep that night, and finally I did. And suddenly I was just rudely awakened to the sound of music, loud music. And it got louder still, so much so that the floor and walls began to vibrate. And then it went from there, but suddenly I heard someone yelling, "Last dance." And I couldn't fall asleep after that. In fact, I barely slept for 9 months thereafter. But it wasn't just the music. Inside of me, there were tidal waves of anxiety washing over every pore and crevice of my body. I was born in 1942 in the Netherlands during World War II, and I'm Jewish. And at the age of 7 months, my parents decided it's best to place me in hiding. And so a nursing student arrives from the Dutch resistance, and she bundles me up, and we vanish into the night. My parents go into hiding as well, with false identities. They move to the countryside until they are caught and beaten severely. And then my father is shipped to a transition camp called Westerbork, and my mother, who was blue-eyed and fair-skinned, was threatened and basically told that if she ever associated with Jews again, she would be killed. In contrast, I was placed at a family whose name is Dijkstra, Moeder and Vader Dijkstra. And this is a Protestant family with 2 young daughters named Anneke and Foley. And they loved me. They cared for me. They nurtured me. And I bonded with them. And this was the only family I truly knew. The war ends. I'm 3 years old. My parents, after a frantic search, find me. But who were these strangers who called themselves my parents? I was totally uprooted, confused, angry, and I promptly burned the bathroom curtains. And then I wander off from time to time in search of my real parents. This goes on for a while. Later on, in 45, my sister is born. And a few weeks after that, my parents bring home a puppy, and we name him Whitey. And Whitey and me were like that. I just loved the dog. He was not only my playmate, he protected me. And he gave me the nurturing that my parents couldn't. In 1949, the war's recession was still raging, and my parents could no longer tolerate the nightmares that they had. And so we go to Israel. But I couldn't take Whitey with me or my neighborhood. In Israel, we're placed in a kibbutz called Bet Ashita, and on the kibbutz, the children lived separately in a dorm. And that was a blessing to me because I was still very much in turmoil. I needed the distance from my parents at that time. And I was the Dutch boy. I was the outsider. And I got into a lot of fights. And I never wanted to tell my parents about that because I never wanted them to ever worry again. But one evening, when I was invited to dinner at their house, my father noticed the bruises on my face and he said, "What happened to you, son?" And I said very quickly, "Oh, I fell into a hole." And he said equally quickly, "Well, next time carry a big stick with you." And within months thereafter, some of the very kids that I had fights with became my friends. And slowly but surely, I really folded into the rhythm of that community. I was recognized. I was part of it, and I loved it. And my father loved it too, as did my sister. But my mother was absolutely outraged because she had to share her children with that larger community, especially her son. And so 4 years later, we are bound for America, but we first stay at temporary housing where my uncle finds a litter of fox terrier dogs under his bungalow. And he gives us one, and we promptly call her Gura. And Gura and I were inseparable. Wherever I went, she would follow. And on the last day, when we took the bus that would take us to the ship and to America, I'm sitting in the back of the bus and I look through the rear window and I see her running after the bus as long as she could. It was 1953, and I'm 11, and we're in Rockaway Park at a house where other aunts and uncles stayed before us. And my father gets a job in the garment industry, and my mother begins to clean homes. And I start picking empty bottles off the beach, and in that process, I saw all of the happiness on the faces of people. And the more I saw that, the more alone I felt. And I longed to be back in Israel. 2 years after that, we move again. And I realized that each time we move, the old emotional scars are peeled open again, and new wounds are forming. On this occasion, my father got a job as a supervisor at a large chicken farm in Monticello, New York. And so we moved. A couple of years later, I finally clicked the social scene. I'm involved. And I actually excel in sports, and so I become somewhat popular. And my parents insist at that very moment, "I think you need to start helping in the house." And so I got a job after school, and my self-esteem vanishes. At the same time, we get a letter from Holland that Moeder Dijkstra died. Now, I had not been directly in contact with her for 10 years, but I was overwhelmed with grief. And no matter what my parents tried to do, they couldn't console me. A few years after that, I graduate, I'm 18, and we move again. We're moving to Queens to the very same house. And the reason was that we wanted to be near, or my parents wanted to be near to our extended family. And I saw this as a great opportunity to leave the house, finally. But my parents had other thoughts, and I continued to contribute half of my salary for another half dozen years. But at 21, I bolted out of the house and moved in with my cousin Andy. And he introduced me to a world, an avant-garde world that I never knew existed. And I stopped working immediately and only worked sporadically for the next 12 years. And I started performing with the Bread and Puppet Theater. I'm on all of the anti-war marches and picket lines, and I travel extensively. dabble in drugs. I'm flying, literally. And I knew this was a time to actually begin focusing on myself, but I really couldn't do it at that moment in my life. I needed to be unburdened and free. And so thereafter, I meet Sheila, my future wife, and we start dating, and eventually we started living together, and decided that we should go on a big trip. So a year goes by, and we amass $5,000, and we buy 2 round-trip tickets that were good for a year, some camping gear, and we're off to Europe, to Holland in particular, because my parents, in the interim, moved back to Holland. And we stay with them for a while, but then we hitch our way to Morocco, because there's a hippie colony near a fishing village along the Atlantic. And I truly felt on top of the moment. 9 months later, we returned to the States, continue our lives, but Sheila is getting more serious about her future. I resist all of that. I just want to continue flying on my magic carpet. 2 years go by, and we're visiting my parents in Amsterdam, and we're crossing the street, and I extend my arm to my mother and say, "Hey, why don't you grab that as we cross?" And she pushes my arm away and says, "I don't need you. I can cross the road by myself." And for some reason, it just rips me apart. And it really sends me in a downward spiral. It's 1975, and I live on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in a tenement flat above a bar. And I can't sleep for fear that I would not wake up. When I ate, I worried about gagging. I was totally vulnerable, and I felt everything on a visceral level. My sister and Sheila encouraged me to go into therapy. I distrusted therapy, as I distrusted so many things. But I do it for them. I go into therapy. And I'm in therapy for 8 months or so, and one of the people in it suddenly yells at me, "Stop wasting my time." Well, I was totally embarrassed, but it was a wake-up call. And things started to percolate. I got involved, and I started to localize my feelings. For the first time, I was able to focus anger at my parents. You see, until that time, I rationalized why they had to give me away. They needed to give me away for my safety as well as theirs. Now, I could actually feel that sense of abandonment. I could feel depression. I could feel love. And I was able to share that feeling of love with Sheila in a different way than ever before. And it suddenly dawned on me that I was able to put my past into perspective. It no longer overwhelmed me. And I was convinced that I could change. So soon thereafter, I trimmed my hair. It was quite long. And I had a wild mustache, and I shaved that off and got an adult job working at a preschool as a business manager. And 3 years later, in 1980, I became an American citizen and, in fact, welcomed my parents back to live in the States, which they did it, and then found the defining job of my career, which was working as the business manager of Friends Seminary a Quaker independent school in Lower Manhattan. And I loved the collegiality of that place and totally admired their Quaker underpinnings. A few months after that, our son Jake was born. And a couple of years after that, Sheila and I founded a school, a preschool called Beginnings Nursery. And Jake, in fact, started attending Friends. And so suddenly, I became aware of the fact that all that was meaningful to me, my family, my work, was within a one-block radius, a small village, if you will. And I realized I was no longer fragmented and was becoming whole. About 15 years ago, I retired from Friends, and the first thing that we did was get a dog. And the dog's name, we named him Milton. And it was the most precious time that I had with him for 11 years. And he died staring into my eyes. Today, I write, I'm involved in some Quaker projects. I love to cook as well as eat and garden. But most importantly, I walk our new dog, Reuben. Thank you.